24. Take the line of least expectation. The ordinary, extraordinary strategy. People expect your behavior to conform to known patterns and conventions. Your task as a strategist is to upset their expectations, surprise them, and chaos and unpredictability, which they try desperately to keep at bay, enter their world. And in the ensuing mental disturbance, their defenses are down and they are vulnerable. First, do something ordinary and conventional to fix their image of you. Then, hit them with the extraordinary. The terror is greater for being so sudden. Never rely on an unorthodox strategy that worked before. It is conventional the second time around. Sometimes the ordinary is extraordinary because it is unexpected. Unconventional warfare. Thousands of years ago, military leaders, aware of the incredibly high stakes involved in war, would search high and low for anything that could bring their army an advantage on the battlefield. Some generals who were particularly clever would devise novel troop formations or an innovative use of infantry or cavalry. The newness of the tactic would prevent the enemy from anticipating it. The enemy, however, would work hard to come up with a defense against the new strategy, whatever it was, and would often find one quite fast. So what once brought brilliant success and was the epitome of innovation soon no longer worked, and in fact became conventional. Furthermore, in the process of working out a defense against a novel strategy, the enemy itself would often be forced to innovate. Now it was their turn to introduce something surprising and horribly effective. And so the cycle would go on. War has always been ruthless. Nothing stays unconventional for long. It is either innovate or die. In modern times, the constant challenge to top the enemy with something new and unconventional has taken a turn into dirty warfare, loosening the codes of honor and morality that in the past limited what a general could do, at least to some extent. Modern armies have slowly embraced the idea that anything goes. This dynamic is particularly intense in warfare, but it permeates every aspect of human activity. If you are in politics and business and your opponents or competitors come up with a novel strategy, you must adapt it for your own purposes, or better, top it. Their once new tactic becomes conventional and ultimately useless. Our world is so fiercely competitive that one side will almost always end up resorting to something dirty, something outside earlier codes of accepted behavior. Ignore this spiral out of a sense of morality or pride, and you put yourself at a severe disadvantage. You are called to respond, in all likelihood, to fight a little dirty yourself. What we consider unconventional has changed over the years, but the laws that make unconventionality effective, being based on elemental psychology, are timeless. Once you understand the essence of unconventional warfare, you will be able to use it in your daily life. Unconventional warfare has 4 main principles as gleaned from the great practitioners of the art. Work outside the enemy's experience. Your task as a strategist is to know your enemies well. Then use your knowledge to contrive a strategy that goes outside their experience. What they might have read or heard about matters less than their personal experience, which dominates their emotional lives and determines their responses. When the Germans invaded France in 1940, the French had second-hand knowledge of their blitzkrieg style of warfare from their invasion of Poland the year before, but had never experienced it personally and were overwhelmed. Once a strategy is used and is no longer outside your enemy's experience, though, it will not have the same effect if repeated. Unfold the extraordinary out of the ordinary. To Sun Tzu and the ancient Chinese, doing something extraordinary had little effect without a setup of something ordinary. You had to mix the two to fix your opponent's expectations with some banal, ordinary maneuver, a comfortable pattern that they would then expect you to follow. With the enemy sufficiently mesmerized, You would then hit it with the extraordinary, a show of stunning force from an entirely new angle. Framed by the predictable, the blow would have double the impact. Act crazy like a fox. Despite appearances, a lot of disorder and irrationality lurks beneath the surface of society and individuals. That is why we so desperately strain to maintain order, and why people acting irrationally can be terrifying. They are demonstrating that they have lost the walls we build to keep out the irrational. We cannot predict what they will do next, and we tend to give them a wide berth. It is not worth mixing it up with such sources of chaos. On the other hand, these people can also inspire a kind of awe and respect, for secretly we all desire access to the irrational seas churning inside us. In ancient times, the insane were seen as divinely possessed. A residue of that attitude survives. The greatest generals have all had a touch of divine, strategic madness. The secret is to keep this streak under control. Upon occasion, you allow yourself to operate in a way that is deliberately irrational, but less is more. Do this too much, and you may be locked up. Keep the wheels in constant motion. The unconventional is generally the province of the young, who are not comfortable with conventions and take great pleasure in flouting them. The danger is that as we age, we need more comfort and predictability and lose our taste for the unorthodox. This is how Napoleon declined as a strategist. He came to rely more on the size of his army and on its superiority in weapons than on novel strategies and fluid maneuvers. He lost his taste for the spirit of strategy and succumbed to the growing weight of his accumulating years. You must fight the psychological aging process even more than the physical one, for a mind full of stratagems, tricks, and fluid maneuvers will keep you young. Make a point of breaking the habits you have developed, of acting in a way that is contrary to how you have operated in the past. Practice a kind of unconventional warfare on your own mind. Keep the wheels turning and churning the soil so that nothing settles and clumps into the conventional. Historical example. In 219 BC, Rome decided it had had enough of the Carthaginians, who had been stirring up trouble in Spain, where both city-states had valuable colonies. The Romans declared war on Carthage and prepared to send an army to Spain, where the enemy forces were led by the 28-year-old general Hannibal. Before the Romans could reach Hannibal, though, they received the startling news that he was coming to them. He had already marched east, crossing the most treacherous part of the Alps into northern Italy. Because Rome had never imagined that an enemy would attack from that direction, there were no garrisons in the area, and Hannibal's march south toward Rome was unimpeded. His army was relatively small. Only some 26,000 soldiers had survived the crossing of the Alps. The Romans and their allies could field an army of close to 750,000 men. Their legions were the most disciplined and feared fighters in the world, and they had already defeated Carthage in the First Punic War, 20-odd years earlier. But an alien army marching into Italy was a novel surprise, and it stirred the rawest emotions. They had to teach these barbarians a lesson for their brazen invasion. Legions were quickly dispatched to the north to destroy Hannibal. After a few skirmishes, an army under the Roman consul Sempronius Longus prepared to meet the Carthaginians in direct battle near the river Trebia. Sempronius burned with both hatred and ambition. He wanted to crush Hannibal and also to be seen as the savior of Rome. But Hannibal was acting strangely. His light cavalry would cross the river as if to attack the Romans, then retreat back. Were the Carthaginians afraid? Were they ready to make only minor raids and sorties? Finally, Sempronius had had enough and went in pursuit. To make sure he had sufficient forces to defeat the enemy, he brought his entire army across the freezing cold river. It was wintertime, all of which took hours and was exhausting. Finally, however, the two armies met just to the west of the river. At first, as Sempronius had expected, his tough, disciplined legions fared well against the Carthaginians. But on one side, the Roman lines were made up of Gallic tribesmen fighting for the Romans, and here, suddenly, the Carthaginians unleashed a group of elephants ridden by archers. The tribesmen had never seen such beasts. They panicked and fell into a chaotic retreat. At the same time, as if out of nowhere, some 2,000 Carthaginians hidden in dense vegetation near the river fell on the Romans' rear. The Romans fought bravely to get out of the trap that Hannibal had laid for them, but thousands of them drowned in the frigid waters of the Trebia. The battle was a disaster, and back in Rome, emotions turned from outrage to anxiety. Legions were quickly dispatched to block the most accessible passes in the Apennines, the mountains that ran across central Italy. But once again, Hannibal defied expectations. He crossed the Apennines at their most unlikely, most inhospitable point, one that no army had ever passed through before, because of the treacherous marshes on the other side. But after 4 days of trudging through soft mud, Hannibal brought the Carthaginians to safe ground. Then, in yet another clever ambush, he defeated a Roman army at Lake Trasimene, in present-day Umbria. Now his path to Rome was clear. In a state of near panic, the Roman Republic resorted to the ancient tradition of appointing a dictator to lead them through the crisis. Their new leader, Fabius Maximus, quickly built up the city's walls and enlarged the Roman army, then watched perplexed as Hannibal bypassed Rome and headed south into Apulia, the most fertile part of Italy, and began to devastate the countryside. Determined first and foremost to protect Rome, Fabius came up with a novel strategy. He would post his legions in mountainous areas where Hannibal's cavalry would be harmless, and he would harass the Carthaginians in a guerrilla-style campaign, denying them supplies and isolating them in their position so far from home. Avoiding direct battle with their formidable leader at all costs, he would defeat them by exhausting them. But many Romans saw Fabius's strategy as disgraceful and unmanly. Worse, as Hannibal continued to raid the countryside, he hit none of Fabius's many properties, making it seem as if the two were in cahoots. Fabius became more and more unpopular. Having razed Apulia, Hannibal entered a fertile plain in Campania to Rome's south, terrain that Fabius knew well. Finally, deciding he had to act, or be thrown out of power, the dictator devised a trap. He stationed Roman armies at all the exit points from the plain, each army close enough to support the other. But Hannibal had entered Campania through the eastern mountain pass of Aliphi, and Fabius noticed that he never left by the same route he entered. Although Fabius kept a sufficiently large Roman garrison at Aliphi just in case, he reinforced the other passes in greater numbers. The beast, he thought, was caged. Eventually, Hannibal's supplies would run out, and he would be forced to try to break through. Fabius would wait. In the weeks to come, Hannibal sent his cavalry north, perhaps trying to break out in that direction. He also plundered the richest farms in the area. Fabius saw through his tricks. He was trying to bait the Romans into a battle of his choice. But Fabius was determined to fight on his own terms, and only when the enemy tried to retreat from the trap. Anyway, he knew Hannibal would try to break through to the east, the only direction that afforded him a clean break into country the Romans did not control. One night, the Roman soldiers guarding the pass at Aliphi saw sights and heard sounds that made them think they were losing their minds. An enormous army, signaled by thousands of torches, seemed to be heading up the pass, covering its slopes, accompanied by loud bellowing sounds, as if possessed by some evil demon. The army seemed irresistible, far larger than the maximum estimate of Hannibal's strength. Afraid that it would climb above them and surround them, the Romans fled from their garrison, abandoning the pass, too scared even to look behind them. And a few hours later, Hannibal's army came through, escaping from Fabius's cordon. No Roman leader could figure out what Hannibal had conjured up on the slopes that night, and by the following year, Fabius was out of power. The consul Terentius Varro burned to avenge the disgrace of Alafi. The Carthaginians were encamped near Cannae, in southeastern Italy, not far from modern Bari. Varro marched to face them there, and as the two armies arrayed themselves in ranks to meet in battle, he could only have felt supremely confident. The terrain was clear, the enemy was in full view. There could be no hidden armies or last-minute tricks, and the Romans outnumbered the Carthaginians by 2-1. The battle began. At first the Romans seemed to have the edge. The center of the Carthaginian line proved surprisingly weak and easily gave ground. The Romans attacked this center with force, hoping to break through and indeed pushing forward, when, to their shock and horror, they looked behind them and saw the two outer ends of the Carthaginian lines moving around to encircle them. They were trapped in a lethal embrace. It was a slaughter. Cannae would go down in history as Rome's most devastating and humiliating defeat. The war with Hannibal would drag on for years. Carthage never sent him the reinforcements that might have turned the tide, and the much larger and more powerful Roman army was able to recover from its many defeats at his hands. But Hannibal had earned a terrifying reputation. Despite their superior numbers, the Romans became so frightened of Hannibal that they avoided battle with him like the plague. Interpretation. Hannibal must be considered the ancient master of the military art of the unorthodox. A psychologist before his time, he understood that an enemy that is caught by surprise loses its discipline and sense of security. When chaos strikes those who are particularly rigid and orderly to begin with, such as the people and armies of Rome, it has double the destructive power. And surprise can never be mechanical, repetitive, or routine. That would be a contradiction in terms. Surprise takes constant adaptation, creativity, and a mischievous pleasure in playing the trickster. So Hannibal always took the route that Rome least expected him to take. The road through the Alps, for example, considered impassable to an army and therefore unguarded. Eventually, inevitably, the Romans caught on and began to expect him to take the least obvious route. At that point, it was the obvious that was unexpected, as at Alafi. At Alafi, Hannibal had bundles of kindling tied to the horns of oxen, then lit them and sent the terrified bellowing animals up the slopes to the pass at night, creating an indecipherable image to the Roman sentries, literally in the dark, and a terrifying one. At Cannae, where the Romans were by this time expecting the unorthodox, Hannibal disguised his stratagem in broad daylight, lining up his army like any other army of the period. On and on he went, each one of Hannibal's ingeniously unorthodox maneuvers flowering out of the other in a constant alternation between the uncanny and the banal, the hidden and the obvious. Adapting Hannibal's method to your own daily battles will bring you untold power. Using your knowledge of your enemy's psychology and way of thinking, you must calculate your opening moves to be what they least expect. The line of least expectation is the line of least resistance. People cannot defend themselves against what they cannot foresee. With less resistance in your path, the progress you make will inflate their impression of your power. Hannibal's small army seemed to the Romans much larger than it really was. Once they come to expect some extraordinary maneuver on your part, hit them with the ordinary. Establish a reputation for the unconventional, and you set your opponents on their heels. Knowing to anticipate the unexpected is not the same thing as knowing what the unexpected will be. Before long, your opponents will give way to your reputation alone. Reversal. There is never any value in attacking opponents from a direction or in a way that they expect, allowing them to stiffen their resistance. That is, unless your strategy is suicide.